The bitter wind howled through the empty streets of Abiquiu, New Mexico territory, carrying with it the promise of the harshest winter the small frontier town had seen in decades. Victoria Hayes clutched her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders as she trudged through the growing snowdrifts, the weight of her circumstances bearing down on her more heavily than the icy flakes accumulating on her bonnet. Just 3 days ago, she'd had a home, a job at the millinery, and if not a bright future, at least a secure one. Now she had nothing but the clothes on her back and the small bundle of possessions tucked under her arm. The fire had taken everything else. Victoria paused at the edge of town, her breath forming clouds in the frigid December air of 1875. The mountains loomed dark and foreboding in the distance, indifferent to her plight. She was 22 years old, alone in a town where she'd lived barely 6 months, not long enough to form the kinds of bonds that might save her now. Mrs. Whittaker at the boarding house had been kind enough, but with half her rooms reduced to charred timber, she had no space to offer, not even a corner to sleep in. "You've got family somewhere, surely?" the older woman had asked, concern etched on her weathered face. Victoria hadn't the heart to explain that her parents were long dead, her only brother lost to the war more than a decade ago. Instead, she'd nodded vaguely and walked away, pride preventing her from begging. Now that pride seemed foolish as the temperature continued to drop and the daylight began to fade. Victoria had spent the previous night huddled in the back room of the church, but the minister's wife had made it clear that arrangement couldn't continue. The town had limited resources, especially with winter setting in so fiercely. A violent gust of wind nearly knocked Victoria off her feet. She stumbled, catching herself on the weathered post of a fence that marked the boundary between the town proper and the outlying homesteads. Looking up, she noticed smoke curling from a chimney about half a mile in the distance. A ranch house substantial by the looks of it stood against the darkening sky. Victoria hesitated. Approaching a stranger's home, especially as night fell, wasn't something a respectable woman did. But the alternative was a night in the open, which would likely mean death in this weather. Taking a deep breath, she forced her frozen feet forward. The path to the ranch house seemed endless as the snow deepened, her thin boots providing little protection against the cold. By the time Victoria reached the porch, she could no longer feel her toes, and her fingers had turned an alarming shade of blue. She raised a trembling hand to knock on the solid wooden door, hearing the sound of movement within. The door swung open, revealing a tall man silhouetted against the warm glow of a fire. He stood there, one hand on the doorframe, the other resting near his hip where Victoria could make out the outline of a holstered pistol. "Can I help you, madam?" His voice was deep, cautious, but not unkind. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The warmth emanating from the house, the contrast between it and the frozen world she'd been trudging through, overwhelmed her. She swayed slightly on her feet. "Miss." There was concern in his voice now. "Are you all right?" Victoria began, but the world suddenly tilted. The last thing she remembered was the sensation of strong arms catching her as darkness claimed her vision. When Victoria regained consciousness, she was lying on a comfortable sofa near a roaring fire. A heavy quilt covered her, and her wet boots and stockings had been removed, her feet wrapped in dry blankets. For a moment, she simply blinked at the ceiling, disoriented by the sudden transition from freezing darkness to warmth and light. "You're awake." The same deep voice from earlier came from somewhere to her right. Victoria turned her head to see the man sitting in a chair nearby, watching her with a mixture of concern and wariness. In the firelight, she could see him clearly now. He was perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair that fell just below his collar and a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore simple clothes, a flannel shirt, sturdy trousers, and suspenders. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms. I apologize for the intrusion," Victoria managed, her voice hoarse. She tried to sit up but found herself weaker than expected. "Easy now," the man said, rising from his chair to adjust the pillow behind her head. "You were half frozen when you collapsed on my doorstep. Lucky I heard your knock." Victoria's cheeks burned with embarrassment despite the lingering chill in her body. "Thank you, Mr. Keller, Kieran Keller. Most folks just call me Keller." He moved to the stove where a pot simmered. "Think you can manage some broth? Got venison stew that's been cooking since morning." Victoria nodded gratefully. "Victoria Hayes. I was a resident of Abiquiu until yesterday." Keller returned with a steaming bowl and spoon. "Careful, it's hot," he warned, placing it on a small table next to her. "And what happened yesterday, Miss Hayes, that has you wandering in a blizzard?" Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the bowl. "There was a fire at Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house where I was staying. Half the building is gone." She paused, taking a small sip of the rich broth. It was delicious, warming her from the inside. "I've been in Abiquiu only since June. I don't have. There wasn't anywhere for me to go." Keller nodded, his expression giving away little. "The fire took everything, I take it, nearly. I managed to grab a few things." Victoria gestured weakly toward her small bundle, which had been placed on a chair. "My savings were modest, not enough for a stage ticket out, especially with the passes likely snowed in now." Keller returned to his chair, studying her with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Victoria was suddenly conscious of her bedraggled appearance, her once neat dress stained with soot and snow, her hair having escaped its pins to hang in damp tendrils around her face. "Well, Miss Hayes, seems to me you have two choices," Keller said finally. "You can stay the night and head back to town tomorrow to see if someone there might take you in. Or," he paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully, "you can stay here until you sort out your situation. I've got a spare room. It's not much, but it's dry and warm." Victoria stared at him, astonished by the offer from this stranger. "That's very generous, Mr. Keller, but I couldn't impose." "It's not generosity," he interrupted, his tone matter of fact. "It's common decency. No one should be out in this weather. Besides," he added, a hint of something like embarrassment crossing his face, "I could use some help around here. My housekeeper, Mrs. Donnelly, went to stay with her daughter in Santa Fe last month. Baby coming, and she wanted to be there. Wasn't supposed to be gone this long, but the weather turned." Victoria took another sip of broth, considering his words. The offer seemed genuine and her options were non-existent. "I can cook," she said finally, "and clean. I'm quite capable." A small smile touched Keller's mouth, softening his weathered features. "Never doubted it, Miss Hayes. You look like a woman who knows her way around work." He stood, stretching slightly. "Rest now. We can talk more in the morning. Your room's through there." He nodded toward a hallway. "Second door on the left when you're ready. Bathroom's at the end of the hall if you want to wash up." As he turned to leave, Victoria called after him, "Mr. Keller." When he paused, looking back, she met his gaze steadily. "Thank you, truly." He nodded once, almost awkwardly, then disappeared into what she presumed was his bedroom. Left alone, Victoria finished her stew, feeling strength return to her limbs. The fire crackled companionably, and for the first time since the alarm had sounded at the boarding house, she felt something like hope. Tomorrow she would figure out a more permanent solution, but tonight, at least, she was safe. Later, clean and dressed in a nightgown she'd managed to save from the fire, Victoria lay in the small but comfortable bed in Keller's spare room. The wind still howled outside, rattling the window panes, but inside the solid ranch house, all was peaceful. As she drifted towards sleep, Victoria wondered about the solitary cowboy who had taken her in. There was a story there. She could see it in the spare furnishings of the house, in the careful way he kept his distance, in the shadows that occasionally crossed his face. But that was for another day. Tonight, she was simply grateful for the roof over her head and the unexpected kindness of a stranger. Morning arrived with brilliant sunshine that belied the bitter cold. Victoria awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement in the kitchen. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly in her one remaining dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days, and pinned her hair into a neat bun before making her way to the kitchen. Keller stood at the stove, his back to her, frying bacon in a cast-iron skillet. He'd already been outside. She could see snow melting from his boots by the door, and his coat hung on a peg, still dusted with white. "Good morning," Victoria said, feeling oddly shy. In the clear light of day, she was acutely aware of the impropriety of her situation alone in a house with a man she barely knew, miles from town. Keller turned, spatula in hand. "Morning. Coffee's ready if you want some." He nodded toward a pot on the stove. "Cups in that cabinet there." Victoria moved to pour herself a cup, grateful for something to do. "Thank you. How bad is it outside?" 8 inches at least, still coming down in the higher elevations. Keller transferred the bacon to a plate. "Road to town will be passable, but only just. Wouldn't recommend traveling unless necessary." "I see." Victoria sipped her coffee, noting with approval that it was strong and well made. "Mr. Keller, about your offer." "Just Keller is fine," he interrupted, cracking eggs into the hot bacon fat. "Nobody calls me Mr. except the banker in town, and that's only because he's hoping I'll take out a loan." There was a hint of dry humor in his voice that Victoria found surprisingly appealing. "Keller, then," she amended with a small smile. "About your offer for me to stay." "I'm willing to accept, at least until conditions improve. In exchange, I'm happy to take over the household duties: cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever needs doing." Keller nodded, his expression unreadable. "Fair enough. I can pay you wages too, same as I paid Mrs. Donnelly." Victoria blinked in surprise. "That's generous, but the room and board is payment enough for now. Perhaps we can revisit the topic if my stay extends." "Suit yourself." Keller slid eggs onto 2 plates alongside the bacon. "There's bread there if you want to toast it over the fire." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Victoria found herself studying Keller when he wasn't looking. In daylight, she could see that his eyes were a striking shade of gray-blue, like the winter sky after a storm. There were lines at their corners that spoke of squinting into the sun, and a small scar bisected his left eyebrow. His hands were large and calloused, but he handled his utensils with surprising grace. "Been in New Mexico territory long?" Keller asked suddenly, breaking into her thoughts. Victoria flushed slightly, hoping he hadn't noticed her scrutiny. "Just since June, as I mentioned. I came from St. Louis originally. After my parents died, there was little reason to stay. St. Louis is a long way to travel alone." "Yes." Victoria didn't elaborate. The journey had been arduous and at times frightening, but she'd had little choice. The memories her family home held had become too painful to bear after her mother's death, and the vultures' distant relatives, family friends, hopeful suitors had descended quickly, offering false sympathy while eyeing the modest inheritance. Keller seemed to sense her reluctance to discuss it further. "Well, Abiquiu's a decent enough place, small, but the people are mostly good-hearted. Yes, I found it quite welcoming. I had a position at Mrs. Thornton's millinery shop. She's been teaching me the trade." Victoria sighed. "I'll need to let her know what's happened, though I imagine word of the fire has spread. I can ride into town later, check on your situation there," Keller offered. "Need to get feed for the horses anyway. You're welcome to come along or stay here where it's warm." "I'll stay if you don't mind. I'm afraid my boots aren't suited for this weather." Victoria hesitated, then added, "Perhaps you could inquire at the general store about purchasing some more appropriate footwear. I have a little money saved." Keller nodded. "I'll see what they have. Might have some of Mrs. Donnelly's things in a trunk somewhere too. She's about your height, though wider through the middle." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Any other errands while I'm in town? If you could let Mrs. Thornton know I'm safe, I'd appreciate it. And perhaps, if there's news about when repairs might begin on the boarding house, consider it done." Keller stood, collecting their empty plates. When Victoria reached to take them from him, their fingers brushed briefly. She tried to ignore the small jolt of awareness that passed through her at the contact. After Keller departed for town, Victoria set about exploring the house properly. It was larger than it had appeared from outside, with 4 bedrooms, though only 2 seemed to be in use. The furnishings were sturdy rather than fashionable, but everything was neat and well maintained. There were few personal touches, no photographs or mementos visible, nothing to tell her about the man who had taken her in. The kitchen was well equipped, and the pantry surprisingly well stocked for a bachelor living alone. Victoria found flour, sugar, coffee, dried fruits, and canned vegetables, along with smoked meats hanging from hooks. Clearly, Keller was prepared for winter isolation. After taking inventory, Victoria rolled up her sleeves and began a thorough cleaning of the main rooms. Though not filthy by any means, the house showed signs of a man living alone without help for several weeks. Dust on the higher shelves, tracked in dirt near the doors, dishes stacked haphazardly in the cupboards. By mid-afternoon, she had worked up a satisfying sweat despite the chill air outside. The main rooms gleamed, bread dough was rising by the stove, and a stew simmered for dinner. Victoria was just considering what to tackle next when the sound of hoofbeats announced Keller's return. She moved to the window, watching as he dismounted from his horse, a magnificent bay gelding, and led it toward the barn. His movements were fluid and confident, at home in this harsh landscape in a way Victoria suspected she would never be. Yet there was something compelling about his self-sufficiency, his quiet capability. When Keller entered the house some 20 minutes later, the scent of fresh bread greeted him. He stomped snow from his boots and hung his coat, revealing a package tucked under his arm. "Smells good in here," he commented, looking around at the transformed space. "Thank you. I hope you don't mind that I rearranged a few things." "Not at all." Keller set the package on the table. "Got your boots. Mr. Chen at the mercantile said these should hold up well, lined with rabbit fur." He pushed the package toward her. "And some wool stockings, too." Victoria unwrapped the package, revealing a pair of sturdy leather boots, simply made but of good quality. "They're perfect, thank you. What do I owe you? Consider it an advance on your work here." Keller hung his hat on a peg. "Spoke to Mrs. Thornton. She was relieved to hear you're safe. Says to tell you your position is waiting whenever you can return." Relief washed over Victoria. "That's wonderful news. And the boarding house?" Keller's expression grew more serious. "That's less promising." "Building won't be habitable for months, from what I hear. Mrs. Whittaker is staying with her sister for now. Most of the other boarders had family nearby." "I see." Victoria tried to hide her disappointment, though she had expected as much. "And there's no other accommodation available in town?" "Not that I could find." Keller hesitated, then added gruffly, "My offer stands. "You're welcome here as long as necessary." Victoria studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. "You're certain? I wouldn't want to impose more than necessary. I wouldn't have offered if I didn't mean it." Keller's tone was matter of fact. "Besides, place hasn't been this clean since Mrs. Donnelly left, and whatever you're cooking smells better than anything I've managed in weeks." A small smile curved Victoria's lips. "Well then, I suppose we have an arrangement at least until spring." "Suppose we do." Keller met her gaze, and for a moment, Victoria felt a strange connection between them, two solitary people finding unexpected companionship in the depths of winter. The days settled into a rhythm as December deepened toward Christmas. Victoria took charge of the household duties with quiet efficiency, finding satisfaction in creating order and comfort. Keller spent his days tending to the small herd of cattle he kept, repairing equipment in the barn, and hunting to supplement their food stores. They saw little of each other during daylight hours, but evenings were spent in companionable domesticity, sharing meals, occasionally reading by the fire, and slowly, cautiously, learning about each other. Victoria discovered that Keller had fought for the Union in the war, though he spoke little about those years. He had come west afterward, working as a ranch hand before saving enough to purchase his own modest spread 5 years ago. He was respected in Abiquiu, if not precisely well liked his preference for solitude, sometimes mistaken for standoffishness. For his part, Keller learned that Victoria had been a teacher briefly in St. Louis before her parents' deaths from influenza 3 years prior. She had no close family remaining and had come west seeking a fresh start, drawn by Mrs. Thornton's advertisement for an assistant in a territorial newspaper. "Never thought I'd end up in New Mexico," Victoria confessed one evening as they sat by the fire after dinner. Outside, another snowstorm howled, but inside all was warm and peaceful. "When I was a girl, I imagined living in Boston or New York, surrounded by books and culture." Keller looked up from the bridle he was repairing. "Abiquiu must seem mighty primitive in comparison." "Different," Victoria corrected, "but not without its own kind of beauty. The first time I saw the mountains at sunrise," she smiled at the memory, "I'd never seen anything like it. The way the light changes the colors of the rocks throughout the day, it's like watching a painting come to life." Keller nodded, his expression softening. "That's what got me too, the sky here, bigger than anywhere else I've been." "Exactly." Victoria picked up her mending one of Keller's shirts that had torn at the shoulder, "though I admit I wasn't prepared for how harsh winter would be." "First one's always the hardest." Keller's hands worked steadily at the leather straps. "Gets easier when you know what to expect." Victoria's needle paused. "Do you think? Do you imagine I'll still be here next winter?" Keller looked up, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "That would depend on your plans, I suppose." "Yes, of course." Victoria returned to her mending, unsure why the question had flustered her. Of course she wouldn't be here next winter. By spring, the boarding house would be repaired, or perhaps she would save enough for a ticket elsewhere. This arrangement was temporary, a sanctuary in a storm, nothing more. Yet as the days passed, Victoria found herself less eager for the snow to melt. There was something peaceful about life at the ranch, about the uncomplicated honesty of days measured in practical tasks and quiet evenings. Keller was a considerate housemate, respectful of her privacy and appreciative of her efforts. They worked well together, developing an easy understanding that required few words, and if sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster, or if her own gaze lingered on his strong profile as he read by lamplight. Well, that was merely the natural consequence of two people sharing close quarters through a long winter. A week before Christmas, Keller rode into town again, returning with supplies and a small pine tree strapped to his saddle. Victoria watched in surprise as he carried it into the house. "What's this?" she asked, though the answer was obvious: Christmas tree. Keller set it down in the corner of the main room. "Thought you might want to decorate it. Found a box of ornaments in the attic belonged to the previous owners. Never bothered with it myself, but—" He shrugged, suddenly looking almost bashful. "Seemed like something you might enjoy." Warmth spread through Victoria's chest at the thoughtful gesture. "It's perfect. Thank you." Together they set up the tree, Victoria directing as Keller secured it in a bucket filled with rocks and water. The ornaments proved to be a charming collection of hand-painted glass balls and carved wooden figures. Victoria arranged them carefully, while Keller watched from his chair, occasionally offering suggestions. "We need something for the top," Victoria said, stepping back to admire their work. "A star or an angel." Keller disappeared into his bedroom, returning with a small carved wooden star. "Made this years ago. Not much to look at, but it's beautiful," Victoria interrupted sincerely, taking the star from him. The carving was simple but elegant, the wood polished smooth by handling. "Did you make it?" Keller nodded, a hint of color touching his cheekbones. "Whittling passes the time on winter nights." Victoria placed the star atop the tree, then stepped back to stand beside Keller, admiring the effect. "There. Now it feels like Christmas." "Been a while since this place felt festive," Keller admitted quietly. "Nice change." Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that they had moved beyond mere convenience into something like friendship. Victoria smiled, and after a moment, Keller smiled back, a rare, full smile that transformed his usually serious face and made him look younger, almost boyish. "I should check on dinner," Victoria said, reluctantly breaking the moment. As she moved toward the kitchen, Keller called after her. "Victoria!" She turned. Surprised by his use of her first name, he had continued to call her Miss Hayes despite her invitations to be less formal. "Yes, I'm glad you're here." The simple statement, delivered in his straightforward way, affected her more deeply than any flowery speech might have. "So am I," she replied softly, and meant it. Christmas Day dawned clear and bright, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a glittering wonderland. Victoria woke early, excitement bubbling in her chest like a child's. She had prepared as much as possible the day before a special dinner, with a small roast Keller had brought back from his last hunting trip, fresh bread, and preserves from the cellar. She had even managed to secret away ingredients for a simple apple cake, measuring and mixing while Keller was out tending to the animals. More meaningful to her was the gift she had crafted for him, a new scarf knitted from wool yarn she'd found in Mrs. Donnelly's sewing basket. She had worked on it during the afternoons while Keller was outside, hiding it whenever she heard his footsteps approaching the house. Victoria dressed with special care, putting on her best dress, a deep green wool with only minor smoke damage near the hem from the fire. She pinned her hair more elaborately than usual, and even dabbed a tiny bit of rose water behind her ears, a luxury she rarely indulged in. When she emerged from her room, she found Keller already awake, stoking the fire. He too seemed to have made an effort with his appearance. His hair was neatly combed, his usual flannel replaced with a clean white shirt, and he appeared to have trimmed his beard. "Merry Christmas," Victoria said, suddenly shy. Keller turned, and something flickered in his eyes as he took in her appearance. "Merry Christmas," he replied, his voice deeper than usual. "You look very nice." "Thank you." Victoria moved toward the kitchen. "I'll start breakfast. I thought we might have flapjacks if that suits you." "Sounds perfect." Keller hesitated, then added, "I have something for you, for Christmas, I mean." Victoria's heart gave a little skip. What a coincidence! I have something for you as well. They exchanged awkward smiles, both apparently uncertain of the protocol for gift giving between a bachelor rancher and his temporary housekeeper, who was rapidly becoming something more complicated. After breakfast, which Keller declared the best flapjacks he'd ever eaten, they moved to the sitting room. Victoria retrieved her package from her bedroom, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of red yarn she'd saved for the occasion. Keller, meanwhile, produced a small wooden box from behind a stack of books. They sat across from each other, the Christmas tree glowing in the morning light that streamed through the windows. "You first," Victoria urged, pushing her package toward him. Keller carefully untied the yarn and unwrapped the paper, revealing the scarf a deep blue that she'd thought would complement his eyes, with a simple pattern worked into the border. "You made this?" he asked, running his fingers over the soft wool. Victoria nodded. "I noticed your old one was rather worn. I hope the color is acceptable." "It's perfect," Keller said, wrapping it around his neck despite the warmth of the room. "No one's made anything for me in a very long time." The simple statement tugged at Victoria's heart. How lonely his life must have been before she arrived, with only occasional visits from his housekeeper for company. "Your turn," Keller said, pushing the wooden box toward her. Victoria opened it carefully, gasping when she saw what lay inside. Nestled on a bed of soft cloth was a delicate wooden carving of a rose in full bloom, the details so fine she could almost imagine its scent. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the wood polished to a warm glow. "Keller, this is beautiful," she breathed, lifting it carefully from the box. "Did you make this?" He nodded, a hint of color touching his cheekbones. "Been working on it evenings in the barn, wanted to give you something that would last." Victoria was deeply touched by the time and effort the gift represented. "I'll treasure it always," she said softly. Their eyes met across the space between them, and Victoria felt a now familiar flutter in her chest. There was something growing between them, something neither had put into words, but which was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. The moment was broken by a sudden gust of wind that rattled the windows. Keller cleared his throat and stood. "Should check on the animals before the weather turns again. Won't be long." Victoria nodded, still holding the carved rose. "Dinner will be ready when you return." The rest of Christmas Day passed in a gentle haze of good food, warm conversation, and an increasing awareness of each other. By the time they retired for the night, something had definitely shifted between them. A door had opened, even if neither was quite ready to step through it. January brought some of the coldest weather Victoria had ever experienced. Days when the temperature dropped so low that the moisture in the air crystallized, hanging suspended like diamond dust. Nights when the boards of the house contracted and cracked with sharp reports that sometimes woke her from sleep. On one such night, Victoria found herself unable to return to slumber after being startled awake. The fire in her small stove had burned low, and despite the extra blankets Keller had provided, she shivered beneath the covers. After tossing and turning for what felt like hours, she decided to venture to the kitchen for some warm milk. Wrapping her shawl tightly around her nightgown, Victoria tiptoed down the hallway, trying to avoid the boards that creaked. As she approached the main room, she was surprised to see a faint glow. The main fireplace was still burning low and a figure sat before it. "Keller," she whispered. He turned, unsurprised by her appearance. "Can't sleep either." Victoria shook her head, moving closer to the fire's warmth. "It's the cold and the noises. The house sounds like it's in pain." "Wood contracting," Keller explained. "Happens every winter. You get used to it eventually." "May I join you?" Victoria gestured toward the other chair. Of course. Victoria settled into the chair, tucking her feet beneath her for warmth. In the firelight, with his guard down, Keller looked different, younger, less weathered by life. He wore only a union suit and trousers, his feet bare despite the cold, his hair tousled from bed. "What keeps you awake?" she asked after a comfortable silence. Keller poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up the chimney. "Old ghosts," he said finally. "War memories, mostly. They come back on the coldest nights." Victoria nodded, understanding. Though she hadn't fought in the war, she had seen its aftermath, the men who returned to St. Louis broken in body and spirit, the widows and orphans left behind. "My brother died at Antietam," she said quietly. "He was only 19. Keller's eyes met hers across the space between them. "I'm sorry, I was there, bloodiest day of my life." "You were." Victoria leaned forward slightly. "What was it like? No one ever wanted to tell me the truth of it." Keller was silent for so long that Victoria thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a low voice, he began to speak, haltingly at first, then with increasing fluidity, as if a dam had broken. He told her about the cornfield where men fell like wheat before a scythe, about Bloody Lane where the dead piled 3 deep, about the bridge where the final push occurred. Victoria listened without interruption, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, not just for her brother, but for all of them, including the young Kieran Keller who had gone to war a boy and returned a man with shadows in his eyes. When he finally fell silent, Victoria reached across the space between them and took his hand. His skin was rough with calluses, but his touch was gentle as his fingers curled around hers. "Thank you," she whispered, "for telling me the truth." Keller nodded, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. "Never spoke of it before, not to anyone. I'm honored by your trust." They sat like that, hands linked, as the fire burned low and the cold pressed against the windows. There was comfort in the contact, in the shared understanding of loss and survival. Finally, as the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Keller reluctantly released her hand. "Should try to get some sleep before the day begins." Victoria nodded, equally reluctant to break the intimacy of the moment. "Yes, of course." As they rose from their chairs, they found themselves standing closer than propriety allowed, close enough that Victoria could feel the warmth radiating from Keller's body, could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped to her lips and he swayed slightly forward. Then, with visible effort, he stepped back. "Good night, Victoria," he said, his voice rough with something she dared not name. "Good night, Keller," she replied softly. As she returned to her cold bed, Victoria knew that whatever was growing between them had just taken root more deeply. The question now was whether either of them would have the courage to nurture it into bloom. The weeks that followed brought a gradual thaw, not just in the weather, as January gave way to February, but in the careful distance Keller had maintained. He began to speak more freely about his life before Abiquiu, about his hopes for his small ranch, about books he had read and places he had seen. Victoria, in turn, shared more of herself, her childhood in St. Louis, her brief career as a teacher, her dreams of someday owning her own millinery shop. They developed small rituals that anchored their days: coffee shared at dawn before Keller headed out to his chores, dinner by lamplight where they discussed the day's events, evenings by the fire where they sometimes read aloud to each other from Keller's modest collection of books. Victoria taught Keller to play checkers, and he proved a surprisingly quick study, soon challenging her to hard-fought matches that often ended in good-natured arguments. As February progressed, Keller began taking Victoria on short rides around the property when weather permitted. She had limited experience with horses, but under his patient instruction, she gained confidence on the gentle mare he chose for her. These excursions became the highlight of her day's opportunities to escape the confines of the house and see the stunning winter landscape from a new perspective. On one such ride in late February, they ventured farther than usual, following a ridge that offered views across the valley to the mountains beyond. The day was unusually mild, the snow beginning to recede from south-facing slopes, revealing patches of earth that hinted at the coming spring. They stopped to rest the horses at the highest point of the ridge. Keller spread a blanket on a dry patch of ground, and they sat side by side, sharing bread and cheese and dried apples from the provisions Victoria had packed. "It's so beautiful," Victoria said, gazing out at the vista before them. The afternoon sun gilded the snow-covered peaks, while shadows pooled blue in the valleys between. "I never imagined such vastness could exist." Keller nodded, his eyes on the landscape. "First time I saw this view, I knew I'd found home." He glanced at her, an unusual vulnerability in his expression. "Never thought I'd have anyone to share it with, though." Victoria's heart quickened at his words and the look that accompanied them. "I'm glad you shared it with me," she said softly. Keller's gaze held hers, and in it, she read questions, hesitations, and something deeper that made her breath catch. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Victoria," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not good with words, never have been, but I need to tell you." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "These past months having you at the ranch, it's changed things, changed me." Victoria leaned slightly into his touch, encouraging him. "It's changed me too," she admitted. "When you first arrived, I thought you'd be gone as soon as the snow melted." Keller's thumb traced a gentle pattern on her cheekbone. "Now I find myself dreading the spring." Victoria's heart soared at his confession. "Why?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Because I'm afraid you'll leave," Keller said simply. "And I've discovered I very much want you to stay." The honesty of his words moved her deeply. This was not a practiced courtship speech, but the raw truth of a man unused to revealing his heart. "What if I told you I've been having similar thoughts?" Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That the idea of returning to town, of not seeing you each day, has become unthinkable." Hope flared in Keller's eyes. "Then I'd ask you to consider staying, not as my housekeeper." He took a deep breath. "As my wife." Though she had begun to hope for such an outcome, the directness of his proposal still took Victoria by surprise. "Keller," she began, but he gently pressed his fingers to her lips. "You don't need to answer now," he said. "It's a big decision. I know I'm not much of a catch, just a rancher with modest prospects, but I promise you this. I would do everything in my power to make you happy. To give you a good life here." Victoria removed his hand from her lips but kept hold of it, lacing her fingers through his. "You undervalue yourself," she said firmly. "You're a good man, Kieran Keller, kind and honest and strong. Any woman would be fortunate to call you husband." Keller's expression softened at her use of his first name. "Does that mean?" Victoria smiled, her heart full to bursting. "It means yes, I would be honored to be your wife." For a moment, Keller seemed stunned by her acceptance. Then, with a joy that transformed his features, he pulled her gently toward him. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice husky. In answer, Victoria closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them nervous despite their happiness. Then Keller's arm circled her waist, drawing her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that sent warmth cascading through Victoria's body despite the winter air. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Keller rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd find this," he murmured. Someone to share my life with, to build a future with. Victoria stroked his cheek, feeling the roughness of his beard against her palm. Nor did I, especially not in the midst of a winter storm. Keller chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her. Seems we both found shelter where we least expected it. They remained on the ridge until the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, talking of plans and dreams, exchanging soft kisses, and marveling at the turn their lives had taken. As they rode back to the ranch, side by side in the lengthening shadows, Victoria felt a sense of rightness, of coming home in a way that had nothing to do with buildings and everything to do with the man beside her. The wedding took place in early April, when the worst of winter had released its grip on Abiquiu, and the first wildflowers were beginning to dot the hillsides. It was a small ceremony in the town's modest church, attended by the handful of friends Keller had made during his years in the territory, and the few acquaintances Victoria had formed during her brief residence before the fire. Mrs. Thornton had been understanding about Victoria's decision not to return to the millinery shop, offering her blessing along with a beautiful bonnet as a wedding gift. Mrs. Whitaker came from her sister's home for the occasion, bringing with her the few possessions of Victoria's that had been salvaged from the fire. Victoria wore a simple dress of ivory muslin that she had sewn herself, with Mrs. Donnelly returned from Santa Fe in March, offering guidance and moral support. Keller, looking both nervous and proud in a new suit ordered from Santa Fe, waited for her at the altar with an expression that made Victoria's heart swell with happiness. The minister spoke of building a life together, of weathering storms and celebrating joys, of creating a home that would stand against whatever trials might come. As Victoria and Keller exchanged vows, she reflected on how they had already begun that work, transforming his house into a home, learning to support each other through difficult days and peaceful ones alike. After the ceremony, there was a modest celebration at the ranch, with neighbors and townsfolk bringing food and good wishes. As the afternoon waned into evening, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in the home that was now truly theirs together. "Happy, Mrs. Keller?" Kieran asked, drawing Victoria into his arms as the door closed behind the last guest. Victoria smiled up at him, still adjusting to her new name. "Completely," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "And you, Mr. Keller?" "Any regrets about taking in a half-frozen stranger on a winter's night?" "Only that I almost didn't hear your knock," he replied, tightening his arms around her. "Best decision I ever made, opening that door." As twilight deepened into night, they stood together by the window, watching as stars appeared one by one in the vast New Mexico sky. Victoria leaned back against her husband's chest, his arms wrapped securely around her waist, and thought about the journey that had brought her here, the losses and hardships that had seemed so devastating at the time, yet had ultimately led her to this moment of perfect contentment. "I love you, Kieran," she said, speaking the words aloud for the first time. His arms tightened around her, and she felt his lips press against her hair. "And I love you, Victoria, more than I ever thought possible." In that moment, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in a person. The winter that had nearly claimed her life had instead given her a new beginning, a love that would warm her through all the seasons to come. 5 years later, Victoria stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Kieran taught their 3-year-old son, James, to ride his first pony. The little boy's delighted laughter carried across the yard as the gentle animal plodded in a circle, Kieran's hand steady on the lead rope. "Not too fast, James," Victoria called, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly where their second child grew. The doctor in Santa Fe had predicted another boy, but Victoria secretly hoped for a daughter this time, a little girl with Kieran's blue eyes and stubborn determination. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. What had once been a bachelor's sparse dwelling was now a thriving home, with vegetable gardens, fruit trees beginning to bear, and a reputation in the territory for fine horses thanks to Kieran's careful breeding program. Victoria had even established a small side business, creating hats for the ladies of Abiquiu and occasionally sending special orders to Santa Fe. More meaningful than these material successes was the life they had built together, a partnership based on deep respect and ever-growing love. They had weathered difficult times, a drought in their second year that threatened the cattle herd, Victoria's dangerous fever after James's birth, a flash flood that had destroyed part of the lower pasture. But they had faced each challenge together, emerging stronger for the trials. As Kieran lifted James from the pony and set him on his shoulders, both of them waving to Victoria, she felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. From the desperate young woman who had nowhere to turn when winter came, she had transformed into a wife, a mother, a woman confident in her place in the world. Kieran approached the porch, James still perched on his shoulders. "Everything all right?" he asked, noticing her tears. Victoria nodded, smiling through the moisture in her eyes. "Just thinking about how fortunate we are, how different things might have been if you hadn't opened your door that night." Kieran set James down, ruffling the boy's dark hair. "Go find Aunt Martha in the kitchen," he told him, referring to Mrs. Donnelly, who had become like family over the years. "See if those cookies are ready yet." As James scampered off, Kieran climbed the steps to join Victoria on the porch. Though the years of hard work had added a few more lines to his face and streaks of silver to his temples, his eyes still held the same warmth when they looked at her. "I was the fortunate one," he said, taking her hands in his. "Getting the chance to love you has been the greatest gift of my life." Victoria leaned into his embrace, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "And loving you has been mine," she whispered. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Victoria thought of all the sunsets they had shared and all those yet to come. The winter that had once threatened to take everything from her had instead given her everything she could have wished for: a home, a family, and a love that would sustain her all the days of her life.